Warning: viewer discretion is advised. Welcome back to Meals To Unalive For. I'm Jody Breton, and this is where food and memory meet, and not everything stays in the past. Let's get into it. Today we're making turkey, potatoes, salad, and pumpkin pie, and this was the last meal of Mr. Jeffrey Lundgren. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't lurk in dark alleyways. Sometimes they stand in front of a room, preaching, teaching, convincing people that they've been chosen by God. Today's story takes us to Kirkland, Ohio, and it centers around a man who convinced a group of devoted followers that he had divine authority. His name was Jeffrey Lundgren. And on April of 1989, 5 members of a single family were led into a barn, executed one by one, and buried in a pit beneath the floor. The people who committed those murders believed that they were carrying out God's will. But how does something like that happen? How does a religious study group transform into a murder cult? To understand that, we have to start long before the killings, long before the barn, and long before Jeffrey Lundgren declared himself a prophet. Jeffrey Lundgren was born on May 3, 1950 in Independence, Missouri. He was raised in the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the RLDS Church, which is now called the Community of Christ. According to Lundgren himself, as well as several people who knew him growing up, his childhood was deeply troubled. He reportedly experienced severe abuse, particularly at the hands of his father. The environment he grew up in appears to have left a lasting mark on him. During his middle school and high school years, Lundgren was described by many as a loner. He didn't have many close friends and often kept to himself. However, as he entered his teenage years, he began spending more time with his father, particularly hunting. Through those experiences, Lundgren became an extremely skilled hunter and developed a strong familiarity with firearms, learning how to use them and maintain them properly. After graduating from high school, Lundgren enrolled at Central Missouri State University. During this time, he spent time at a house specifically built for RLDS youth who were attending the university. It was there that he met 2 people who would play important roles in his life: Alice Keeler and Keith Johnson. Alice Keeler, like Lundgren, had experienced abuse during her childhood. The two quickly formed a strong connection, bonding over their shared experiences. Their relationship developed quickly, and in 1970, Jeffrey Lundgren and Alice Keeler were married. Later that same year, on December 2nd, 1970, the couple welcomed their first child, a son. By 1974, Alice was pregnant again. Around the same time as his marriage, Lundgren enlisted in the United States Navy. During this time in the service, he attempted to obtain an early release, arguing that his presence was necessary to support and provide for his growing family. However, the Navy denied his request. Lundgren ultimately completed his full enlistment and received an honorable discharge just days before his 4-year term officially ended. Not long after returning home, the couple welcomed their second son. Following his discharge from the Navy, Lundgren moved his family to San Diego, California, hoping to build a stable life there, but financial difficulties soon began to take a toll. Eventually, the Lundgrens made the final decision to move back to Missouri in search of better opportunities. In 1979, Alice gave birth to the couple's third child, a daughter. However, according to people close to the family, this period of their lives were increasingly tense. Friends and acquaintances later said that Lundgren appeared frustrated with the family's financial struggles, and some believed he had grown resentful towards his wife. After the birth of their daughter, reports suggest that Lundgren became physically abusive towards Alice. At one point, hospital records show that Alice Keeler was admitted with a ruptured spleen, an injury that may have been caused when Lundgren allegedly pushed her into a closet door handle. Despite these growing problems within the marriage, the couple had another child the following year. In 1980, they welcomed their 4th child, another son. From the outside, the Lundgrens appeared to be a typical young family struggling to make ends meet. But behind closed doors, tensions were mounting, and circumstances that would eventually shape Jeffrey Lundgren's future were already beginning to take form. In the summer of 1984, Jeffrey Lundgren moved his family from Missouri to Kirtland, Ohio, where he accepted a position as a senior temple guide. The job did not provide a salary, but it did include housing for Lundgren and his family near the temple. At first, Lundgren made a very positive impression. He gained attention through his Sunday school classes and his work guiding visitors through the temple. William Russell, a religion professor at an RLDS college, later testified that Lundgren had an exceptional knowledge of Scripture, particularly the Book of Mormon. Lundgren often used what is known as the chiastic method of interpretation when studying religious texts. This method focuses on identifying repeating patterns and structures within Scripture to uncover deeper meanings. While Lundgren was skilled in this analytical approach, Russell noted that he often overlooked the broader historical context of the Bible, instead of focusing heavily on the more esoteric interpretations. Even so, Lundgren's teachings were not entirely outside the traditions of the RLDS faith. He frequently spoke about visions, personal spiritual experiences, and direct communication from God, concepts that were not uncommon in the church's history. For the next 3 years, Lundgren worked as a temple guide and taught classes on the Bible and the Book of Mormon. During this time, however, problems began to surface. The church required that all donations from temple visitors be turned over to the church, but Lundgren began soliciting contributions and keeping some of the money for himself. As time went on, temple donations began to decline significantly, and even the temple bookstore began to experience financial shortages. Eventually, church leaders took action. Lundgren was first removed from his role as a religion teacher, and in October of 1987, he was officially dismissed from his position as temple guide. Shortly afterward, he and his family were evicted from their living quarters next to the temple. Despite his dismissal from the temple, Lundgren had already begun attracting a loyal group of followers. Starting around 1985, his classes had drawn increasing attention because of his deep knowledge of the religious texts and his confident style of teaching. Some students became so devoted to Lundgren and his interpretations that they began reorganizing their lives around him. Eventually, several followers moved in with the Lundgren family. Among them was Kevin Curry, Sharon Bletchley, Richard Brand, Daniel Kraft, and Gregory Winship. In April of 1988, Debbie Olivares also joined the group. Those living with the Lundgrens referred to Jeffrey as Dad. Members of the group pooled their resources, contributing their paychecks and savings to cover shared expenses. Other couples supported Lundgren financially as well, even though they did not live with him. Among them were Ron and Susan Luff and Dennis and Tanya Patrick. By the spring of 1987, Lundgren's influence had spread far enough that another family relocated to follow his teachings. This was the Avery family, who moved from Missouri to be closer to Lundgren and his growing religious community. The family included Dennis Avery, age 49, his wife Cheryl, 46, their 3 daughters, Trina, 15, Rebecca, 13, and Karen, just 7 years old. At the time, the Averys believed they were joining a community built on shared faith and spiritual guidance. What they couldn't have known was that within just a few years, the same community would become the center of one of the most disturbing cult murders in American history. After Jeffrey Lundgren was evicted from the temple property, he and his followers relocated to a rented farmhouse nearby. But being pushed out of the church didn't weaken Lundgren's influence over his followers. If anything, it seemed to strengthen it. From the farmhouse, Lundgren continued teaching and preaching, placing an even greater emphasis on the spiritual importance of the Kirkland Temple. According to him, the temple wasn't just historically significant, it was central to God's plan for the end of times. Lundgren told his followers that one day the temple would be recaptured. He claimed that after it was reclaimed, a massive earthquake would lift the temple itself, and it would become the place where Christ would eventually return to earth to establish Zion. His teachings grew increasingly dramatic and apocalyptic. Lundgren spoke openly about having visions and about holding direct conversations with God. drawing heavily from the Book of Revelation and the Book of Mormon. He introduced a disturbing idea he referred to as pruning the vineyard. According to Lundgren, before Zion could be established, certain people would need to be removed, eliminated, like diseased branches cut from a vine. The men in the group began preparing for what they believed was coming conflict. They carried out paramilitary style training, practicing with weapons and preparing for the day that they might attempt to seize the Kirkland Temple by force. At one point, Lundgren even chose a specific day, May 3rd, his own birthday, as the day they would retake the temple. But as the date approached, he suddenly changed course, claiming that the time was not yet right. By October of 1988, the RLDS Church had officially excommunicated Lundgren, cutting him off completely. But by then, he had already built something far more powerful than a church position. He had built absolute control over a small group of devoted followers, and soon that control would lead to murder. By early 1989, Lundgren began telling his followers that they needed to prepare for a wilderness journey, a step he claimed was necessary before Zion could finally be established. The group took him seriously. Members began quitting their jobs, buying supplies, and gathering everything they owned. Lundgren even encouraged them to max out their credit cards, insisting that worldly debt wouldn't matter once their spiritual mission was complete. But while the group prepared for this supposed journey, another plan was quietly unfolding, a much darker one. Around April 12, 1989, several followers secretly began digging a 6 by 7 foot pit into the dirt floor of the Lundgren's barn. At the same time, Lundgren instructed Cheryl Avery to write a letter to her relatives, telling them that the family planned to move to Wyoming. The letter would help explain their sudden disappearance. Then Lundgren invited the Avery family to dinner. On the evening of April 17, 1989, Dennis and Cheryl Avery arrived at the farmhouse with their daughters, Trina, Rebecca, and little Karen, who was only 7 years old. The family sat together and shared a normal meal. At least that's what the Averys believed was happening. After dinner, Lundgren walked out to the barn with his son Damon and 4 followers: Richard Brand, Daniel Kraft, Gregory Winship, and Ron Luft. Inside the farmhouse, the Avery family remained with the women and children, unaware of what was about to happen. Then, following Lundgren's instructions, Ron Luft began bringing the family members out to the barn one at a time. Each victim was bound with duct tape and gagged before being led to the pit. One by one, they were forced inside. And once they were there, Jeffrey Lundgren shot them 2 or 3 times with a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. Dennis, Cheryl, Trina, Rebecca, and finally Karen, the youngest. When it was over, the bodies were buried in the pit. Dirt and stones were shoveled over the grave, and when the killing was finished, Lundgren and his followers simply returned to the farmhouse, where they held a prayer meeting. The very next day, April 18th, police officers and FBI agents arrived at the property after receiving reports about a possible plan to assault the Kirkland Temple. Everyone at the farmhouse insisted they were there voluntarily and denied knowing anything about violent plans. Authorities left without making any arrests. Soon after, Lundgren led the group on a wilderness journey, just as he had been talking about. They traveled to remote campsites near Davis, West Virginia, where they lived in tents for months, remaining there until October of 1989. Some members found jobs nearby while the men continued their military-style training, but tensions inside the group were growing. During their time in West Virginia, Lundgren began taking additional wives. First, he chose Tanya Patrick as the second wife, but when that arrangement collapsed, he selected Katherine Johnson instead. That decision deeply angered Larry Johnson, Katherine's husband, and it created serious conflict inside the group. By October 1989, Lundgren, his family, and about 10 followers had moved back to Missouri. The group was beginning to fracture. And by the end of December 1989, Larry Johnson made a decision that would finally expose the truth. He contacted federal authorities and told them what had happened to the Avery family. On January 3rd, 1990, police in Kirkland returned to the Lundgren property and began digging inside the barn. Not long after they started, they uncovered Dennis Avery's body. The remaining members of the family were found the following day. The autopsy results were chilling. Dennis Avery had been shot twice in the back. Cheryl Avery had been shot 3 times in the torso. Trina had been shot once in the head and twice in the body. Rebecca had been shot in the back and thigh. And little Karen Avery had been shot in the head and chest. All 5 victims had silver duct tape wrapped around their heads, hands, and feet. Investigators recovered several bullets from the scene and determined that most had been fired from Lundgren's .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun, which he had purchased in 1987 and later sold in West Virginia in October of 1989. Just a few days later, on January 7, 1990, federal agents located Jeffrey Lundgren in California. And there, they finally placed him under arrest, where his reign of terror ended. During a nearly 2-hour parole hearing on September 20th, 2006, Jeffrey Lundgren really didn't show any remorse for what he had done, still claiming that he was a prophet of God. During the conversation, Lundgren spoke about his upbringing, explaining that he had been raised in the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He described his childhood as strict, saying that he had been taught that love was often expressed through judgment and discipline. After receiving an honorable discharge from the United States Navy, Lundgren said that he began studying scripture and the teachings of Joseph Smith more deeply. According to Lundgren, his goal was to grow in spiritual understanding and, in his words, to preserve his people. For the first hour of the interview, Lundgren read from a prepared statement. In it, he discussed figures from the Book of Mormon whom he considered role models, and he read several passages from scripture. Lundgren explained that he believed his background was necessary to help the parole board understand the beliefs that, in his view, led to the murders of the Avery family. Lundgren told the board that he believed that the end of the world was approaching and that he had been called to establish a place where he and his followers could live together, protected from what he saw as approaching danger. This belief, he said, was what led him to Kirkland, Ohio, where he believed he would receive divine instruction, what he referred to as the law of God. He also claimed that he had been chosen to play a role in what he described as a process of redemption, saying that both he and his followers were servants carrying out God's will. Lundgren pointed out that, in his interpretation of history, the church in the 1830s had failed to build a holy city that had been envisioned. He believed it was now his responsibility to complete that task. Lundgren went on to say that he believed there would be serious consequences for failing to obey God's commands. At one point, he compared himself to Moses, claiming that God had spoken to him and instructed him to retrieve sacred records. According to Lundgren, this belief was what ultimately led him to the Kirkland Temple, where he said he hoped to receive a vision and confirm what he believed to be a divine pattern. He described studying the temple's design and comparing it to scripture, believing it contained hidden meaning. During the interview, Lundgren repeated the claim that he had made during his trial, that he believed God had commanded him to commit the murders. In his view, he said reaching Zion required what he described as a spiritual cleansing, which he believed would ultimately protect his family and followers. Despite this, Lundgren told the parole board that he believed that he had since discovered what he called redeeming love. He asked the board to show him mercy and grant clemency, allowing him a chance at redemption. When discussing his personal life, Lundgren said his support system consisted primarily of his wife and daughter, who traveled from Missouri to Ohio roughly once a year to visit him. He explained that he married his wife, Katherine Johnson, sometime in 1992 while he was already in prison. The couple had a 16-year-old daughter together. Lundgren also noted that he no longer had contact with any of his other children. He also told the board that he had first met the Avery family in Missouri while attending their church, and that the family later moved to Ohio to follow his teachings. When he was asked directly how he felt about killing 5 people, including 3 young children, his initial answer was that he felt burdened. He went on to describe himself as a wretched man who should not have judged the Avery family. He said he should have tried to save them instead, and he admitted that he had misinterpreted scripture. At the end of the hearing, the state of Ohio opposed clemency through arguments presented by prosecutor Karen Cowell. Cowell stated that after watching Lundgren's interview, she did not believe he had shown true remorse. She pointed out that Lundgren never plainly said he wished he had not killed the Avery family. Instead, she said his comments suggested only that he regretted not allowing them to plead for their lives. She also argued that the case was not about religion, but about manipulation, specifically Lundgren's exploitation of the weaknesses, fears, and beliefs of the people around him. According to Cowell, Lundgren had not even wanted the Avery family to come to Ohio in the first place and had written them a letter saying so. But once they arrived, she said he forced them to give up their car and money. She further stated that when Lundgren learned Davis Avery had a credit card, he maxed it out, and that he even used that card to purchase the gun later used in the murders. Cowell argued that Lundgren had talked about killing the Avery family for 2 years before the murders happened. She said he considered them disobedient, lazy, weak, and strange, and noted that the Averys were kept at the edge of the group, excluded from living with Lundgren and from some of his religious classes. She also told the board that Lundgren had taken money from many of his followers, and in some cases from their wives as well. She said he had even carried a gun when asking some of the co-defendants whether they were with him in carrying out the murders. Lundgren had even insisted at trial that he was a prophet of God, and because of that, he should not be sentenced to death. He told the jury, "It's not a figment of my imagination that I can, in fact, talk to God, that I can hear his voice. I am a prophet of God. I am even more than a prophet." But in the end, the jury rejected that claim. Jeffrey Lundgren was sentenced to death, while many of the followers who had helped carry out or cover up the murders received life sentences or lengthy prison terms for their own. Jeffrey Don Lundgren was executed by lethal injection on October 24th, 2006. In the hours before his execution, he was given a final meal consisting of turkey, potatoes, pumpkin pie, and salad. Just before the execution, Lundgren delivered a brief final statement. He said, "For my last words, I'd like to profess my love for God, my family, my children, and my beloved wife. I am because you are." Moments later, the execution was carried out, bringing an end to one of the most disturbing cult murder cases in American history. Let me know down in the comments how you felt about this case. I think it was pretty crazy and just very, very sad, the amount of manipulation that was going on. As for the meal today, I think it was pretty decent. I'm not a huge fan of pumpkin pie, I'll be honest. Still turned out great, but again, not a huge fan. The turkey turned out great. My husband handled that this time, and I think he did a pretty great job. If there's a case that you want me to cover, please let me know down in the comments. I love hearing from you guys. As usual, please like and subscribe if you liked this content, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.